Introductions. I'm Vern Cushenberry. I am the Chief Investment Officer of Two West Advisors, and we are hosting this webinar on behalf of our clients to give them a little window into retirement income. And some of you probably recognize this topic as one we've been hitting on for the last 5 or 6 years, and it is coming. This is a timely opportunity to have this conversation because we're going to show you where the industry has come in that time, and I think this conversation is about to crest with some recent legislation. So we all need to be informed about what retirement income is, how it works inside of a retirement plan, how it works to secure the retirements of the participants inside of a retirement plan, and what they need to know, and how they're going to be supported with communication strategies. And all that is built on a foundation of good process, good, prudent process. And it has to be done in concert with what we know to be true about the ERISA legislation and the updates that have been delivered by our lawmakers in the last 3-4 years, which is why I'm thrilled to introduce Bonnie Treichel, who is our guest today and will be sharing her thoughts and slides. Bonnie is our ERISA counsel. She works directly with many of our clients. We keep her very close to our firm because she keeps us in good order and keeps our clients in good order. Bonnie is one of the most plugged in and well networked ERISA attorneys that I know. I genuinely enjoy her company, and I'm excited to hear what she has to tell us about income today. So, Bonnie, thank you for joining us.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to be here. Vern, I know we've had this conversation with some of your clients before. And I think one of the things that's going to be fun about today's chat is maybe we could talk about what's changed and what's actually stayed the same. And we may have some opinions that are exactly the same and some that are different. So I see we've got quite a few people tuned in today, so I'm excited. One thing I'll note is that I believe everyone can access that Q&A feature. So please don't hesitate to throw your questions in. As mentioned, we have had this conversation before. So I'd love to just, and I know Vern, you've been having this conversation directly with some clients as well. So I would love to make this your session for those of you tuning in and touch on those topics in the retirement income space that you want to hear about. So we'll be looking and pick up those questions and maybe even comments as we go, so that this is more of a collaborative discussion, not just Vern and I giving our thoughts and opinions as we go. So we've got a variety of different things we want to cover, everything from kind of where we are in this retirement income conversation to what has been the product and solution evolution, to how do you fit that into your framework? Do you need this? Do you not need this? When do you need it? The how and the why. So with that, we could probably talk for 3 or 4 hours, but instead we'll try to keep this to less than an hour and we'll get started. So, with that, I think a good place to start, Vern and I were chatting at the beginning about something, recently that came out, which is an advisory opinion, which we'll get to here in a little bit. But I made the comment that, hey, our regulators and legislators, they actually want you to have income in your retirement plans. And when I say income, we've got some slides and we can get into more of the term and terminology a little bit later. But before we get there, we should probably just set the stage of like, what are we talking about when we say retirement income? I always jump into this like, hey, let's talk about retirement income. We have a lot of conversations that came from the Pension Protection Act about getting people to save these auto features and getting money in the plan. When we're talking about, or at least the context I'm bringing it up in, when we're talking about income, I mean this in the sense of retirement income. What is someone's paycheck going to be on their first day of retirement through their last day on this earth? How do we help people think about their paycheck during retirement? And that could be both with guarantee sources like annuities and with non-guaranteed sources, those guaranteed sources being that lifetime income component. But the gist of this is, for most of the conversation, it's really focused on that annuity component. What is that set amount that someone can rely on in their retirement years when they're no longer working? Vern, what
I've
did I
heard it
miss
as
there?
I was just going to say, I've heard it described as additional units of Social Security. Like, so everybody understands what Social Security is. Everybody has a family member on Social Security. It's not enough to cover
Yep.
most people's standard of living. Some, but not all. If you look at the math, most retirees are going to fall woefully short of covering their standard of living based on savings rate, which is why this is a topic. Our regulators want to solve this because retirees vote, and retirees aren't getting there. We have a retirement plan crisis on our hands. So that begs the question, what does a successful retirement even look like? And one of my favorite pundits to follow is Dr. Robert Merton, Nobel laureate out of Boston University, and he devoted the majority of his academic career to life cycle finance. And he said a successful retirement looks like a stream of income, think Social Security, that covers your standard of living and has inflationary adjustments throughout the way and continues throughout the life of the participant. So you don't have to worry about longevity risk. If you live to 150, it's going to be there. You don't have to worry about inflation because you're going to get bumps along the way. And Bonnie had just mentioned to me before this call, we're both kind of scratching our heads because we've seen this data, and we're pretty sure that 50% or more of retirement plan participants today, they think that's how a retirement plan works. And it's not surprising when we offer zero education to most people getting inside of the plan that they would think this. So our regulators have said to us as advisors, our regulators have said to us as ERISA attorneys, hey, you guys are smart enough to do this today, go out and get it done. So we're working with providers across the industry to add the components to make the retirement plan system in the United States function like people think it should. There's really no excuse for it not to at this point. So that's this webinar. How do we navigate that future landscape? That's how I think of it from a high level perspective. Anything, Bonnie? What would you add?
Totally agree with you. What's interesting is, we recognize a need, and we'll talk a little bit more about that need here in a moment. Yet, right now, at present, 9 out of 10 retirement plans, they do not offer what we're describing. So I think that's one thing we'll talk a little bit more about today is the current structure that we're talking about of some kind of pensionized component to your 401k plan or 403b plan, that doesn't exist in the vast majority of plans today. So the question is like, why or why not? Because as we know, for the most part, people are actually living longer. So we do have that longevity question. And then we have less or, not as much access to a defined benefit plan. So then the question becomes kind of like, what happens in between there and why don't we have more of a rush to get these structures in place in your 401k plan or your 403b plan? And I should mention, by and large, we're going to talk in terms of ERISA covered plans today. But even where it's not ERISA covered, I think a lot of the same principles apply if you've got some sort of local non ERISA plan. Usually there's some sort of local law that applies. But on this webinar, we're generally going to talk in the ERISA covered space. So we'll
Yeah.
reference guidance from the Department of Labor and such.
And Bonnie, I'd just share that 9 out of 10 plans don't have it today, which is a little bit of perhaps a little bit of an indictment on the industry, but not really, because they could have it. And why don't they have it? And one of the reasons why plans don't have it is that defined contribution plans were never meant to function as the retirement plan solution. They were only ever meant to function as supplementary savings vehicles. When they were launched, they were supplemental to defined benefit plans. And defined benefit plans worked great. As a matter of fact, Social Security worked great when it was launched. The average life expectancy when Social Security was launched was 62. Social Security didn't even start until 62. So it was only meant to ever cover your income stream for about 6 months. Well, longevity outran, the need, and now we need other systems to solve for paychecks for life, so to speak. And there for about 50 years, defined benefit plans worked very well. General Motors, Boeing, think of the blue chip companies that have provided great defined benefits for retirees for decades. My grandfather participated in one of these plans. He retired in 1982 from ConocoPhillips and was in there defined benefit plan until he passed away in 2002. And now my grandmother still collects a check. So they paid that retirement plan benefit for 45 years and are still paying. Well, that was excellent, but problematic, as you might guess, because that put liabilities on corporate America that they didn't manage too well. So the defined benefit plan it's going away in favor of a defined contribution plan, which is good and bad because now participants have full control over the retirement plan balance, but they're not sophisticated investors and they don't necessarily know how to manage that. So now our legislators are stepping in a more heavy-handed way, saying, offer this in a way that participants can understand and tap into. And here we are.
So, Vern, I'm going to throw out a couple of things that I hear when I start kind of the introduction to this conversation. And I think it's a good place because I'll get this question from maybe participants or employees. I get this question sometimes from plan sponsors. And it's like, well, wait a second. So you're telling me I have to annuitize the entire plan, or a participant has to annuitize their entire account balance so they have nothing left in the market. I think that's a helpful clarification to make up front. I describe this as like, it's like layers of a cake, right? Where it's like you might have there's a component of Social Security. There might be a component that is in one of these, I'm going to call it income solutions. And then there might still be a component that is in the market. Is that how these solutions work? Or do you have to, participants got to be all or nothing into one of these solutions?
I like the way you frame that. And it reminds me of a story I like to tell about the trade-offs that you have between design and distribution. So we can send an academic into his ivory tower and have him design something that works perfect in form and function. But if it's not something that the rank and file plan participants can accommodate, it's going nowhere. So you just described, okay, how do we navigate a new solution? How do we build a new solution that everybody in America is going to be able to understand? And we've been communicating to them in terms of account balance for 40 years. So they think about access to $300, $400, $500,000 in retirement plan savings at retirement. That's an entirely different way of thinking than we have access to $3,000 a month, $4,000 a month, or $5,000 a month for life. We have to merge those two things, which is why now the industry is starting to develop solutions that allow participants to say, okay, I only want to annuitize X percent. Is that 10? Is that 20? Is that 30? That's going to be money set aside for my guaranteed lifetime income. I'm not going to be able to access that money at retirement, but there's going to be another portion of cash that could serve many different purposes for the household, depending upon their unique situation and whether or not they have spousal assets, inherited assets, other taxable assets. That's more of a wealth management conversation. And every participant is different, which is why you're seeing dozens of new solutions come to market while we try to understand, which one of these are going to be the winners and which one of these are going to be the losers based on the level of utility that they bring to every individual participant. And it's challenging.
Well, and I think that's the value of having a good, teammate like working with 2S is that you help sift through who are the winners, who are the losers, and which one's the right one. One other thing I want to hit on before we get into a little bit more of the why is right now the time to start having these conversations or thinking about implementation is the question I get around well, if my participants aren't saving enough, why would we even do this? Is there a certain amount that someone has to save where these solutions even make sense? And there was some data a few years back where it said if a participant has saved, and I believe it was around 79,000, that you can actually, again, when combined with Social Security, that around 75 to 100,000 account balance, that is enough that you can actually use one of these solutions when combined with Social Security to create some meaningful stream of income in retirement. On the flip side of that, I get questions about well, don't people just have their own, access to annuities outside of the retirement plan? Why do they need this in the plan? And so, Vern, any thoughts there around kind of can they have too much for this to make sense? Not enough for this to make sense? Any thoughts there for just people looking at their average account balance with their participants, thinking of it from the plan sponsor's perspective?
From the plan sponsor's perspective, I always advise, think like if I'm the sponsor, I want to implement a retirement plan from the perspective of the plan participant. The frustrating part about everything you said is yes, yes, and yes. But the frustrating part about thinking through this is that we know the vast majority of plan participants are not engaged. They're
Mhm.
just not. They're on autopilot. Typically, those contributions go into a target date fund today, and we know the average participant logs into their account once a year or less and makes no decisions with regard to asset allocation. So whatever we choose as the sponsor, we have to do it with that in mind. We have to know that we've selected a solution that's going to make prudent decisions and allocations to an income sleeve over the life of the participant. And I think the solutions that'll win out will take a middle of the road stance, meaning that there's a default that creates some level of guaranteed income for the participant, some level of guaranteed income that simultaneously has liquidity so they can sell out of it and they're not committed to a lifetime of annuity cash flows, but then also gives the participant an opportunity to engage and say for themselves, okay, I'd like to lock more of this up. And in so doing, usually when you lock it up, you do that in exchange for a higher lifetime yield. So if before you had committed, you could, plan on 4%, which for the sake of argument, say that was, $30,000 a year in income. If after you lock it up, you could plan on a higher interest rate, and now you've successfully sold for $55,000 a year of income. And I'm pulling these numbers out of the air, but they're directionally correct. That's the decision that you want the participant to be more involved in. So in my mind, the question really is, well, where do we as a sponsor want to set the bar? We want to give participants the opportunity to engage with guaranteed lifetime income, but we don't want to be overly heavy-handed with it.
So I like one of the things you said there, which gets at, since the Secure Act, the first one, if anyone can think back to that in 2019, there's been all this evolution of new solutions. And I would argue there's around 35 plus new solutions that have come to market in the retirement income space. I think one key thing from the older versions, 2010, 2011, like retirement income solutions are not new. But one key feature of the newer version since 2019 really is that flexibility. And that's what I would describe it as, Vern, is like the flexibility for the participant where they can like lock in some base and then get more upside. Older versions did not have as much flexibility, I don't think. And so some people might have looked at these solutions before and felt like, this isn't for me. I do think there's a new set of flexibility that exists. And I think that's a very helpful feature of these solutions. Um, a couple of
I like that. I like that, Bonnie, and I think that's important we share with our audience that that's one of the key takeaways of this webinar is that the industry is solving for some of those challenges which have historically been very sticky. For example, some of the solutions that we've had for years now would place participant monies in an annuity, and that annuity had 7 to 10 year lockup period. And that caught a lot of participants by surprise. I have participated in a lot of those conversations where, participants just didn't know their money was locked up. The industry has solved for that now, and that's huge. That makes distribution of these solutions much more likely, much more palatable. That's why I say at the top of the call that I think we're at a crest. I think we have solved a lot of the major sticking points.
Yeah, I would say one of the key sticking points I've always described is this concept of portability. And I'm jumping ahead, but I think if I think of what have been two of the major challenges, one was expense and the other one was the portability. And portability I'm going to describe in two ways: plan level portability and participant level portability. So plan level being, and again, I think these are the things when you're thinking about these solutions, and we'll dig into this maybe a bit more here in a moment. But when you're looking at one of these solutions, questions that you want to be really thoughtful about are at the plan level portability. It's, hey, if I decide I don't like this record keeper I'm with, I want to know I can take my income solution and go somewhere else. I can take this and move it, and everyone's not losing what they've already paid into, so to speak. Older solutions, you could not do that. A couple of key record keepers come to mind. Everything was proprietary and that was it. That's really evolved. The other piece is participant level portability. And that's where individual participants, we know people move jobs a lot. We know, they want to be able to take what they've paid into and go somewhere else or roll that to an IRA. That's the key thing, is that people can port that where they go. They're not losing what they've paid into. Vern, would you say there's other kind of key things besides the expense, which fees have come down majorly, and the portability?
Portability is the biggest challenge that remains to the successful distribution of these solutions. And, I would go back to Social Security again. Social Security doesn't care if you change jobs 10 times. They track your total lifetime earnings, and that determines the paycheck that you're going to get in the mail when you turn 65 or 67 or whenever you choose to turn that on. Guaranteed income solutions inside of a retirement plan, well, they don't always work like that. That's one of the challenges. You have to make sure that the portability will follow you from job to job to job. So we have a client right now that's with Fidelity, and they're considering a lifetime income solution, and we're working with them on this with Bonnie's help. And when we go to meet with them, we sit down and we talk to their executive team, and we say, okay, we have to be mindful of where we're doing business. So in 3 years and 5 years, if we're no longer happy with Fidelity and we want to move that business to Schwab or Empower or another record keeping platform, well, we have to remain independent as a fiduciary. And one of the challenging aspects is if we turn the guaranteed income solution on today, well, in 3 years, when we choose to move record keeping platforms, we may or may not be able to bring that with us. So that just puts a lot of onus on the fiduciary to make sure they've done their homework on the front end, and they can document those decisions, why they've made those decisions, and how they're going to navigate that when and if the time frame ever arises.
So I want to remind people, if you have questions or comments, don't forget to put those in the chat or Q&A, pardon me, and we will definitely answer those as we go. I want to briefly talk about the regulatory and legislative push, and then that'll get us into looking at the variety of different solutions that are out there. So again, Vern and I were having a little bit of a back and forth before we started around, hey, do legislators and regulators want you to have in-plan income solutions? And I said emphatically, yes, they do. And the reason I said that is a couple-fold. Going back to 2008 and moving forward, we could put together a timeline of a variety of different things coming from Department of Labor and Treasury, where it's showing DOL and IRS have letter exchanges, some advisory opinions, where they're encouraging in-plan income. And so that really all comes together with Congress adding 3 main provisions to Secure Act of 2019. We don't have to spend a lot of time on that, but one of the key things I wanted to point out there is that you actually get a safe harbor from Congress, which we don't have a ton of those in the retirement plan space. But one of them is this safe harbor, which says that, hey, plan fiduciary, if you are selecting income solutions, you will not have liability for the underlying insurer or maybe multiple insurers if they later go out of business, so long as when you make that selection, you meet a couple of requirements. And we'll talk about here in a moment, those requirements could even be met by someone like a Two West in making that selection for you as a 338 investment manager. And again, it's just looking to see, does this insurer essentially appear to be financially stable at the time they were selected, and then on an ongoing basis. And Congress wants you to select these in-plan income solutions because they recognize, hey, people are going to run out of money if we don't do something to have this pensionized system in the future, or at least that's my belief. Now, again, the safe harbor is optional. You don't have to do it, but it does require that you get a certain set of written representations. And like anything in retirement plans, you do have to look at the actual fees in relation to the benefits. So that analysis or prudent process piece, you do have to do that.
So
We
Bonnie, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
This is something that gives me, well, I'll just ask you the question because I don't know the answer. I know that having worked with you, that safe harbor is dependent upon a prudent process. You make a selection, you have a prudent process, and that means that you're covered, so to speak, from that safe harbor. With these guaranteed income solutions, that guarantee needs to follow the participant around. We just talked about portability. And that creates additional work, additional challenges for the record keeper. They have to keep track of every participant in the plan and what their accumulated guarantee would be over time. And because of that, choice is often limited at the record keeper level. The record keeper will say, okay, we have one or two guaranteed income solutions for you to select from. And sometimes it's one. How do you meet a prudent process if you only have one choice? How do you shop that? How do you compare solutions? How do you benchmark it? How do you do your due diligence? What do you do for reporting? This is kind of our job as the consultant and fiduciary. How do you answer that question?
Well, we just had this conversation in a similar chat, which maybe we'll do a different webinar on managed accounts at some point. But just so, just because something exists only on one record keeping platform doesn't mean you can't have a prudent process. And this applies, some of you might have a brokerage window, even, right? You still have to prudently select and monitor the provider of that window. But you probably only have one self-directed brokerage window option, right? You still have to compare other brokerage window platforms that are available. And you can still run a prudent process and compare. And I'm just going to throw out names. I'm not picking on anyone. Fidelity's option to Empower's option to Schwab's option. If you're on Fidelity and it's that disproportionately different on, Schwab and Empower, you would maybe have to consider, hey, do we need to move to one of these other platforms? Now, then you can look at that operational burden of moving record keepers, but you could at least go through the process and determine, is it going to be worth it to make that move? Or we've gone through this is still going to be a prudent decision. This is a sound decision because of all of these reasons. But it doesn't mean no process, no due diligence, because it's just the only one available. That is not a process, and that's not going to stand up for anyone, not the Department of Labor or, an auditor or a plaintiff's attorney.
Okay, another question for you. And for everybody that's tuned in, I had kind of teed Bonnie up with that last question. I knew what she was going to say, but it can be kind of overwhelming, especially for all you sponsors on the line. You have to adhere to this process. So my question to you is, Bonnie, this move to retirement income has been painfully slow for a lot of us in the industry who were very, very excited about this all the way back in 2017. We've been working on this since 2015. And we've seen real progress, but it does seem painfully slow. And what we're talking about here is at least part of the reason. So what I want to know is, as you look at the industry, have we reached a point where you could say that it feels like we have safety in numbers, meaning that we're through the early adoption stage of onboarding retirement income? This has been tested by the larger billion-dollar plus plans. It's been, it's successfully, or not successfully, but it's attracted the attention of any attorneys who might take issue with how this has been rolled out. Do we have safety in numbers here with regard to, testing these kind of quote unquote, what feels like a new system?
So this was not a question I knew Vern was going to ask. So I have good news and bad news. When we
Right.
say safety in numbers from a retirement plan perspective, the more that you get in assets, the more you become a target to plaintiff's attorneys. So that's probably not a good thing. That being said, I think, Vern, you're asking a really good question, which is I advise clients all the time. I'm like, do not be a first mover at anything. And I know that is very ERISA attorney-ish of me because that stifles innovation and we should encourage innovation. But no one wants to be the first person to try anything at, your record keeper, right? Because you want to get the kinks worked out. But Vern, I think your question is really well taken. Like, have we worked out the kinks enough? We've got some mega plans that have implemented, and now it's time for others to catch on. I 100% think that the initial first movers in the mega plan market, if you look at some of the large numbers that were put forth, like we were chatting ahead of time around like BlackRock's LifePath Paycheck version, they had some press releases about some really big numbers of committed clients. I think Income America, for example, they were an early mover. Multi-insured solution as well. They put out some pretty big numbers of number of plans that had committed and implemented. There have been in all market segments, I feel like we've had some adoption, and there's enough that it's not like, hey, you're going to be the first person in the industry signing up for this type of solution. I would further that to say the White House, so we've talked about regulators in Congress. We also had quite the surprise of it's not every day that we have the attention of the White House for retirement plans. Now, I'm a retirement plan dork, so I get very excited when the White House pays attention to 401k plans. But in August, we actually had the White House paying attention to retirement plans and talking about alternatives in 401k plans. What was super interesting about that is they looped in lifetime income strategies into that executive order. Now, again, it's not the White House saying you must add these solutions, but quickly after that, we had an advisory opinion. So, again, this is the Department of Labor following on and saying, hey, yes, it was particular to one of the solutions from Alliance Bernstein, but it was, again, it's the Department of Labor weighing into those specific facts and circumstances. But what happens is others say, oh, yeah, we have a very similar solution that applies to us as well. So it's good guidance for others and gets Vern to your question of, hey, are enough people doing this and implementing? We can follow along too and feel better about it. I think absolutely, and this advisory opinion is evidence of that because the Department of Labor is once again saying, essentially, not only do we promote them, but we are okay with it as what I'm going to call your default or your qualified default investment alternative, so long as all the other requirements of the QDIA rules are met. I know that's a lot to unpack there, but I think, again, it's not that you have to have these solutions. No one's telling you that, but it is guidance that says if you want them, if you've met your prudent process, you can have them and you can have them as a QDIA.
Well, it's encouraging to hear you say that, Bonnie, because you have a different perspective on the industry than I do. But I, for one, feel like that's the direction that the industry is going in, like this ruling and the notion that very large providers like Alliance Bernstein, they wouldn't position these solutions if they didn't think there was a market for it. And they've been in the market long enough now to have, well, all the squeaky wheels have had an opportunity to raise their hand and say, we don't like this. So the solutions have been pulled back off the shelf, retooled, relaunched. We are much more accurately putting our finger, so to speak, on the pulse of what the participant can accommodate and what they want, where the demand is. So that's obvious. We wouldn't be hosting this webinar if we didn't think that this conversation had merit.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that can help is this gets a little bit tactical, but I think as we shift to maybe the next part of our conversation, we could talk about who should be making which decisions as it relates to income. So, you know, if you're liking what you're hearing today and you're like, hey, this resonates, there's some key considerations in terms of who makes which decisions and how does that apply to responsibility and liability. So, one thing I would encourage is to really understand what hat should someone be wearing to make which decision. Simply said a different way, business owners or settlers, so to speak, can make the decision on what's best for the company. In other words, and I'll kind of go back and forth between these couple of slides, but it's actually can be a plan design decision to say, hey, we want to change the distribution options for the plan and add a guaranteed option or a component. That can be a plan design decision, which is a company decision, which doesn't carry fiduciary liability and responsibility. That can be helpful for people who are worried about being a first mover, additional risk. So the business says, we think we want to have a guaranteed option. That is a business decision, settler decision. And then they tell the fiduciary committee, hey, go work with Vern and team and implement this. And then the fiduciaries are carrying that out to decide which one of those 30 some solutions are appropriate for our participants. Again, that's pretty tactical in nature, but I think that can be helpful to separate settler decisions from fiduciary decisions. And so then they'd work, Vern, with you to decide, and maybe that's where I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about, you know, the matrix that you're keeping to then think through, hey, there's all these solutions out there. How do we know which one is appropriate at what time? Anything that we should touch on, Vern, before we kind of dive into like, how do you know which of these solutions is right?
I'm happy to share my screen. That might help me think through how to even describe this. So I'm gonna share with our audience here a Excel file that I'm working on. Bonnie, can you see this? This Excel file?
I
Let's try it again.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Okay. Okay. So I've been working on this for a while now, and the intent of this is to do a survey of the landscape of solutions that are available to plan participants. And I start with a comparison that every plan sponsor on the line should know: integrated target date fund solutions. So most plans are powered by a QDIA today that includes Vanguard or Dimensional funds or American funds. And these are target dates, and they start very aggressively when a participant is in their 20s, and they de-risk that allocation over time. And by the time a participant gets to their 50s or 60s, you have much less risk. So these target date funds that I've identified here function similarly, only along that glide path somewhere, they begin to layer in guaranteed income. And as they layer in guaranteed income, well, you see every column on this spreadsheet is just another attribute that I, as the chief investment officer, have to be aware of and be able to communicate back to our plan sponsors, because these are fiduciary decisions. How these funds function is a fiduciary decision. So what we want to know is who manages the funds along that glide path, and where in particularly, and how aggressively do they hand off the management of those funds to an insurance company that will guarantee that income. And we just talked about the longevity of this industry, so to speak. You know, these funds launched in the top four launched in 2024, 2023, 2024. So, you know, we're gaining a track record. That AllianceBernstein solution that Bonnie just talked about launched in 2012, so we have a significant track record there. Prudential has a product that goes all the way back to 2007. So this is not a new industry. It's not really even a young industry. We just have reached that crest where we have a lot of managers recognizing the fact that money is beginning to flow into these solutions in a big way, and there's a good reason why. So as a fiduciary, we also need to understand that glide path, that allocation, the handoff from the accumulation phase to the guaranteed income phase. And then we get into column E here, which would be type of guarantee. And annuities come in dozens of different flavors. You know, here you see GLWB on this Excel spreadsheet. What's that mean? Guaranteed limited withdrawal benefit. So you might imagine that you get to age 65 and you have $100,000 in your account. I'm just picking round numbers. Well, with a GLWB associated with that target date fund, the participant can count on the fact that they're going to be able to withdraw 5% of that for life. So they can count on a $5,000 annual paycheck coming from that for the life of the participant. And if they live to be 200 years old, that's going to pay them $5,000 a year every year. That's a GLWB. Others include a deferred annuity, or we might have a qualified longevity annuity contract, or these might be optional, or they might have an immediate annuity or a fixed annuity. These all come in different flavors. We need to be able to understand which is most appropriate for the plan and how a participant would access that. Whether or not there's one or multiple insurers, the fee, like Bonnie mentioned, the record keeping availability. So here in column H, that goes back to the portability Bonnie was talking about. Are these solutions available on all major record keepers, a handful of record keepers? What does that bind the plan sponsor to in terms of future record keeping selections? Because we need to be able to navigate around the industry with that regard. Then I assess portability, I assess participant portability, plan record keeping portability, and then I have a handful of notes on all of these different plans. And that's only the first category, which is target date funds. Then you get down to standalone solutions that can be added to the plan, managed payout funds, out of plan marketplaces, and then there's another burgeoning category of managed accounts that I don't even have on here yet, which would include customized individual participant solutions, where participants have a full array of custom designed portfolios just for them, managed by a 338, which could be like Two West, or it could be like Fidelity or Morningstar or another one of the large providers in the industry. So I only share this to communicate to everybody on the line that this decision it's not the same decision as you make for a target date fund. It's much more expansive, and you need to go through a process like this. Fortunately for everybody on the line, you're attending this webinar, you're familiar with the process, and this has kind of been done for you at this point. I'm happy to share the spreadsheet so you can check the box. Bonnie, what would you add to any of this?
Well, I think so. The spreadsheet is perfect because that provides that documentation of the process. The spreadsheet is also what I've seen as the problem. What I mean by that is now Vern's like, I'm never doing a webinar with you again.
I'm
No,
always
so
always the problem. Always the
no.
problem.
So the spreadsheet's perfect because that's why you work with someone like Two West, because you do have to have that. But the spreadsheet is what I think historically what I'm seeing over the past couple of years is what causes this, paralysis analysis. Okay, we'll just put this aside and do this next year. Oh, wait, how about next year? We're dealing with Roth catch up. Oh, I just don't want to deal with this. I got to do these other things, which must be done today, and this can be done tomorrow, sort of mentality. And so I think what's helpful to understand is that while there are a lot of these different, what I'm going to call levers, as Vern's showing you, I think some of this boils down to some like couple of, I always put it as like a funnel. There's a few big decisions you can make, record keeper being one of them, at least at this point. Do you want it as a QDIA or not? There's a couple big decisions that you can make, which narrow your field really fast. And so, like, if you said, we want to guarantee, well, the managed payout options, they're gone. If you said we must have something that's a QDIA, okay, well, the out of plan marketplace, that's gone. So you can start narrowing your field by a few philosophical decision points that then your levers, because you can't have all things for all people all the time. And so I guess, Vern, I don't know if you would think of that differently, but I think if conversation number one from today is like, we think this makes sense for our people, then it's like, okay, yep, what type of thing makes sense for our people? There's more of that. Do we need to update our plan document to change the distribution options? Okay, great. Then Vern or the team at Two West is going to be able to help narrow that scope. You're not going to be spreadsheeting all of these things on your own. And I think that's helpful context.
Uh, we just got a great question. It says, okay, yes, where do I start? So I love that question because what I want everybody on the line to understand is that you don't need to feel the overwhelm. When it comes to where do I start, you've already started because you're attending this webinar. Now it's just a matter of, well, terrific. We'll tee it up on the agenda for our next plan meeting, and we'll bring two solutions, and we'll get your reaction. Because we need to narrow that funnel, just like Bonnie said. We'll pick out the two solutions that we think like would be worthy of consideration, and we'll have a conversation about it. And if we're spot on, we'll move forward. And if there's an aspect of that, whether it be portability or fee or the type of guarantee or the communication associated with that plan, support materials, hypothetically, then we'll go fishing again. Come back with some other solutions. You just start the conversation would be my answer to that question. Bonnie, what would you add?
I always say, like, start with the education component, which I think is a different flavor of what you just said. It's like, raise your hand and say, I'm interested, so that you can continue to get educated. I always say, which again, Vern probably doesn't like this answer, but I feel like this is not, and you said this earlier, it's not the same as a large cap growth discussion. This is that, like, usually I feel like this is a 12 to 18 month process, because it starts with like a conversation and then another conversation, because it isn't just a like, hey, you brought a large cap growth recommendation, talked about it for a few minutes, and away we go. It is a longer discussion, because you're also probably not going to switch it out 12 months later. This is going to be a more durable, longer lasting option in the plan.
Yeah, these are annuities are like luggage in a good way. You want that. You want them to follow you around for your entire lifetime. Yeah, that's a feature, not a bug.
That I'm going to start using that. It's like, you want to get the to me option. You don't want the one
Yeah.
that's like on sale that you're going to switch out next holiday season. Um, I know we're almost to the top of time. I guess one question, Vern, I have for you, I think this is always a good one, is where do we see the future of retirement income solutions? Like, I ask the question a lot, like, what inning are we in with this discussion? But where do we see this going?
Easy button. It's got to be an easy button. We mentioned the factoid that most people that get into the retirement plans, they think that guaranteed income is what happens when you retire. We haven't solved for that yet, but in the future, I think we will solve for that. So we don't require any participant education. We don't, it doesn't have to be overwhelming for the sponsor. Target date funds just come with these guaranteed income solutions that do follow participants around. We solve for the portability, we solve for the record keeping aspect of it, and participants can retire and expect a paycheck that'll cover their standard of living. We'll get there. We're gonna get there.
And I think some would argue that there will eventually be this kind of concept of multiple retirement income options in a plan, that there might be like a managed payout, there might be one that's a component of your default option, but that it won't just be one income option. It becomes a stronger part of the investment menu. I don't know if you agree or disagree, but I think that is part of what some of the forward looking, again, we're not there today, we're still trying to solve for portability, but I think that is the concept.
Yeah, I'm a fan of a heavy-handed approach, but the cat is out of the bag. We're never going back to less choice. If you want to solve for successful retirement plan, you could solve for it, but uh, this country needs and requires choice. So then to introduce that, it needs to go hand in hand with education. And that's a decision that we're very purposeful about when we're talking to our committees and plan sponsors. Let's make sure that we have an education package that'll give participants what they need to make the right choice.
Absolutely. I know we have several more slides, which if anyone wants copies of the slides, I know those can be made available through your 2S contact. Is there anything, Vern, we did not hit on today, or any questions that we're seeing that we want to make sure we cover before the top of the hour?
Well, I want everybody to understand, to know that they'll get some continuing education credit for this. So we have a list of attendees, but also, reach out to your 2 West representative and let them know that if you can make use of those credits, that we have them in your fiduciary file.
Awesome. And I would just say, I would continue to encourage people to continue the discussion and also just be on the lookout from a participant perspective. I think one thing that's interesting about income, uh, it actually does hit the mainstream media from time to time. So it surprises me how many plan sponsors actually get questions about income. And so I'd just be on the lookout for that. Your participants might be hearing about it and you might not even realize it. So I think there is quite a bit of participant demand out there, or participants, going back to Vern, what you mentioned at the beginning, participants who actually think they have income that don't. So it could be interesting too, to, if you do any participant polling or surveys, to get a better sense of what your participants think they have that they might not. So I would just kind of challenge you to be in touch with your participants on this topic too.